In the last few years, most that follow this platform well know, and that's the growing sense of the disillusionment amongst the public towards the political system, where the pandemic for many over the past couple of years has made this sense even worse. And here in Western Australia, now very much left-leaning since the Mark McGowan stranglehold 2021 election win, and with the federal Labor experiencing a swing here in WA, and that's despite the all-time low primary vote to Labor nationally, this has resulted in federal WA Labor MPs getting a larger presence in the engine room of the Anthony Albanese government. To say it's been a tough time in WA if you have conservative views is an understatement, as Western Australia finds itself with no political voice. Talking politics can be sensitive and contentious, and on the subject of controversy, you wouldn't want to be a bureaucrat in the Senate estimates in the past 2 weeks. And to get better insight with the mechanics of Senate estimates hearing, it's an honour to be able to introduce to you a federal politician who really understands the importance of the people that he represents. South Australians, let me tell you, you don't know how lucky you are to have a man like this on your side. Senator Alex Antic, thank you very much for your time, and from our viewers, welcome to Freedom Media WA.
Oh, look, thanks for having me. It's a bit generous, that intro, but you're right when you say it's a difficult space across the country, I think, to be sharing some of these views. I think the full court press is on from the media, and that's why it's always a pleasure to talk to like-minded people doing great stuff on independent media like you guys. So well done.
Thank you very much. Last week I featured a stream and it's some of the Senate estimates, and I posed this question to the audience. Given that Senate estimates is live streamed, what is your view on the chair suspending proceedings, given that when the going gets tough, because you've touched on matters that highlight that these non-elected bureaucrats have been found wanting?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think the purpose of the whole exercise in shutting things down is to make sure that it doesn't descend into sort of screaming matches and so on and so forth, to raise points of order and those sorts of things. So there's a purpose for it, and a good purpose for it in those environments. But in that case, I think it happened 5 times, and I don't think the questions were particularly difficult. We were talking with some of the bureaucrats about their own vaccination history, which touched a nerve, and some other various issues. And look, it did get a bit tense, and it does break up the flow a little bit. But I know why those procedures are there. I just think they need to be used sparingly, because there were, and in other committees as well, there were a lot of interjections when you're trying to get to the point. So it's certainly not disruptive. Sorry, it certainly is disruptive sometimes, but you can't have these things descending into, and that comes from both sides, by the way. So I think that the chair in mine, that one you're talking about, did the best she could, I think, in the circumstances.
It seems a lot of feedback that we had in relation to that particular stream, there is that growing sense of censorship, that the public is being denied opportunity. But I guess you've just explained the reasons behind that. Can I just ask you, in terms of yourself, if you can explain to people the workload that you find yourself under in having to cover all of these hearings, which predominantly are condensed into a 2-week package, and are you running from room to room?
Yeah, you are a little bit. It is a pretty intense workload. So just to go back a step for your viewers, Senate estimates is a process where in advance of a budget, usually, the Senate is given an opportunity to inquire with the bureaucracy as to how that money is going to be spent, in a nutshell. That's my very simple way of putting it. You also get a second round, which is what we just did then, the supplementary budget estimate. So there's too much to do in 1 week, one sitting, and there's a lot of detail to cover. So there is a lot of running around and a lot of trying to get questions into different committees. There are 4 or so standing committees that deal with various topics, and then each department sort of rolls through. So there's a lot of bureaucrats to cover, and there's a lot of running around, and it's ultimately almost impossible to be across everything. But I personally just feel there are so many issues and such an enormous rise in the power of the unelected in this country and across the world, I have to say, that it's really incumbent on people like me who who are worried about that, worried about the rise of the unelected, to cover as much ground as we can. I mean, one of the first things I was told a few years back when I first came into this job was don't try and cover off on everything. And I think I failed at that quite miserably, honestly, because it feels like there are so many fights to fight that we have to be across everything. So, yeah, look, it's a busy time, but they're very important hearings. And hopefully, by asking the questions that I do and that others do, we can kind of highlight some of the issues that would otherwise be just left on the vine.
I think as an observation here, it seems that there is, if you would call it, bipartisan support that you have with One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts and, of course, the same party Senator Rennick as yourself. But there is that... Well, is there a little bit of a coordinated approach, as you say, because of the number of issues that do need to be tackled?
Look, I wouldn't say coordinated as such. I think we're covering off on some similar issues of interest. I think the three of us probably have a particular interest in the COVID period as I mean, I think I'm not going to speak for Malcolm and for Gerard, but I think all three of us are very concerned by what we saw and very keen to try and get to the bottom of as much of it as we can, even if it's in hindsight. We all took a pretty strong approach during the pandemic. I mean, it's no secret that Gerard and I took issue with, our own side of politics about not doing more. And that's, unfortunate, but, it just happens. I see my job as being bigger than, just, the sort of the single issue. We've got to be across all of them. And so, look, there obviously is a lot of common ground in interest, but there's not really everyone comes armed with their own questions. That's the beauty of Senate estimates, is that each senator, doesn't matter where you're from, which party you're from, can come armed with their own line of questioning. And that's the way it should be. We're there to represent, in my case, SA, and Gerard's case, Queensland, and the same for Malcolm. So, there needs to be that flexibility to be able to ask your own questions. It just happens that I think all three of us are interested in that topic, as a priority.
Well, I think, and another topic that there seems to be a mutual interest, and that's smart cities. And if I can, Senator Antic, I'm going to take you back to August 2017, because I'd be interested to hear your views on this now that you're walking the corridors of federal parliament. And that's back to the days as your councillor with the City of Adelaide, when you spoke on Radio 5AA about the city's position moving the date of Australia Day. Now, look, I'm not looking to poke the work bare on that issue because it's back in hibernation until next year at least. But I want to hone in on this particular comment where you said, quote, that ratepayers' money is being used effectively for activism. And then you further went on to say that I wonder whether sometimes this relates back to some people living out their federal parliamentary fantasies on the floor of local councils. So my question is this. Now that you've transitioned from a local council role for the City of Adelaide to federal parliament, do you see local councils, and you will understand this analogy, are playing the role of ruckman as a rover on the concept and the implementation of these 15-minute cities?
Look, it's a really, really astute and very good observation you make, and I'd actually forgotten about that, and I'm glad to see it sort of stood the test of time. It comes from hopefully being, someone who's had the same set of convictions for decades on end. Nothing's changed there from my point of view. I really did believe it. My first introduction to local government back in, I think it was 2014 when I was elected, was to argue about the installation of a rainbow walk, a rainbow path in the city streets. Now, that's a political statement as far as I'm concerned. Others would take a different view. But ultimately, it was a $200,000 exercise, and I didn't understand why ratepayers, some of whom were paying as much as maybe $1,000 or $1,500 a year in their rates, would be paying for something like that when there are bigger priorities, of course, putting aside the political statement. But when it came to Australia Day, look, local governments have been the tip of the spear on this push to try and change the date. And it does have an impact. Ultimately, if you get councils talking about it, they become news stories. They then provide oxygen for the issue at a higher level. And I think you're right about smart cities. In many respects, local government, you're talking about a layer of government that deals with things that are right outside your front doorstep. So, I think they have to be very, very careful at implementing this sort of surveillance technology, in any event, but certainly at local government level, because there is that ability to sort of change the world almost and do it inadvertently. That, by the way, that smart city agenda was real and was being played out when I was on the council here in Adelaide in 2014, 15. It was being talked about like a virtue. There'll be sensors here to monitor traffic and all that sort of stuff. Nothing's changed. They're still pushing that. They're still pushing it as a virtue. Because it will improve your experience in coming into the city, apparently, and we'll know when the bins need to be collected, we'll know when the toilets need to be cleaned. But I'm very uncomfortable with this, and I'm very uncomfortable with the fact that there's a push for, in certain areas, facial recognition cameras and the harvesting of data, because once these systems are set up, they can be misused. And I'm worried that what we are setting up is this sort of framework for a bigger, badder future. Now, people will tell you that's a conspiracy theory and put on your tinfoil hat, but hang on a minute. We've just lived through this period of COVID where people were locked in their homes, they were surveilled. In Victoria, there were drones flying around looking for people, just like there is in China. And here in South Australia, we had a home quarantine app, which was developed by the government of the day, which was basically a piece of software on your phone, which made sure that if you were meant to be home and you were called on your phone, you could take a photo of yourself, upload it back to the police, and it would confirm that using the GPS data. So we're dangerously close to this already. And my concern is that local councils will simply brick this in, and before we know it, it'll be too late. So I think people are right to be aware of it. It's been a topical issue here in SA. I did a little bit of work highlighting how, on a very early level at least, you can see it playing out at one of our local councils here, and they've even got boards up, screens up in the park down the road from here, where you can see,
yes.
Yeah, you can see all sorts of information that people didn't know was out there. Now, it might be fine at the moment. I don't like it. I don't like where it heads, and I think other people probably wouldn't like it too if they were more across it.
Yeah, and I think it's a significant leap, as you say, that particular package. As I recall, councils are tracking things like how long you are standing at a barbecue cooking in that public space. And it's a big leap to transition to what we've seen in Oxfordshire and the UK. And interestingly, I also did a stream on this the other day, looking at the package that the project Channel 10 put out, and they left out details like these traffic management plans. They're not physical hard barriers. They rely on number plate recognition and facial recognition. And if you go through these filters outside particular times and in excess of 100 days, you get an automatic fine in the mail. To think that you may actually get a fine, to going to a public park to cook a barbecue, does that add on to the fine? I mean, we are, as you say, we're on a dangerous slippery slope. And those would argue and say, if you're a law-abiding citizen, what do you have to worry about? Well, it really is that invasion of privacy for you and people's families. And yeah, it's a scary proposition that local councils are looking at.
Yeah, look, it really is. I mean, it's a really, really, different world we're coming into now, where people just are going to be surveilled. They're literally going to be watched. And you might say, and I often say this to friends, you might say, so what? I've heard people say, I love the fact that someone's watching, it means I'm safe. Well, that depends on whose view of the world you're living under. I know that in the last couple of years, people were very uncomfortable when they should have been with the amount of surveillance and tracking and locking in your homes. I mean, that was just nonsense. And, here we are 2 years later and we've sort of almost forgotten about it. Well, what happens when all of a sudden we are told we're in a climate lockdown and you can't drive your car because, you've driven your 50 kilometres for the week and you're up, or you can't go down to the shops and buy a steak because, you're saving the planet, can't use the barbecue in your park. I don't think those things are as far away as people would scoff at, and I'm sure you'd get scoffed at. I'd get scoffed at in the mainstream media or on project, TV shows like The Project, which I just don't watch. But I'm sure they would have a very different worldview on it. But the reality is we are coming to that, and people need to be aware of it, and it needs to be discussed and debated properly, and politics has got to start paying attention to these issues, because that is part of the issue at the moment, I think, in parliaments across the country, is the big ticket issues are perhaps being glossed over for things that may be solutions looking for problems, like the voice to parliament.
And that, and I guess on the Voice Department, I was going to ask you a question on that, but 24 hours in any day is a long time. 24-hour in politics perhaps may seem, like a week. As you would know, we've seen the government has come out on superannuation, and I guess what's interesting in relation to this particular issue here is that the talk started last week where it allegedly or purported to be a debate, but the government clearly came out and said that the first thing that they were looking to do at superannuation was stop people from being able to withdraw from their accounts what Liberal pushed out, the Morrison government made available for people who were under hardship because of pandemic lockdowns. Can I ask you, Senator Antic, do you see this as a broken promise?
Look, I mean, I think it has to be classed in those terms. We weren't told about this, the election by the Albanese government. And, now we're being told that there are going to be changes to the superannuation rules, the superannuation legislation. And it's being pitched along the lines of, it's only for the big end of town. And, it's only if you're over $3 million and all this sort of stuff. And we haven't seen the detail yet. Now, first of all, let's start with the observation that, yes, of course, it's a broken promise. Secondly, this is not just a compact to change the rules on people when they're halfway through their retirement plan. I mean, if you've saved and worked and had a successful business and stored a lot of money away, it's totally unreasonable in my mind that the government goes and changes the rules on you retrospectively such that you might have had to change your entire plan. It's not reasonable and it's not right. But they'll pitch this along the lines of, these are just rich people we're taking money from. Rubbish. These are hard-working Australians that money is being pinched from. And the really worrying thing is this: if that's the beginning of it, where does this slippery slope end? Does this end up in, further attacks on retirement? Does this further attacks on capital gains tax, on the sort of the franking credits that was such a big issue at the 2019 election? Where does it end? If they're prepared to change their tune on this in order to sort of pay down some of this debt, then where does it end? And I think people have got every right to be angry about this and worried about the future.
And I think to bring the viewers up to speed, I'm just going to play a package of Anthony Albanese. This is 2 weeks prior to the election. And if we, let's just take a look at what he said on superannuation.
Does Labor commit to the current super arrangements for self-funded retirees and other superannuants? And do you rule out any increases to super taxes and changes to caps?
We've said we have no intention of making any super changes. One of the things that we're doing in this campaign is we're making all of our policies clear. We're putting them out there for all to see.
It's quite clear there what he said in relation to that. You've mentioned the big end of town. I guess it's important that people understand, wind this back just 1 week.
We said during the election campaign that we did not intend to make big changes to superannuation, and we don't. We've said we have no intention of making any super changes.
And it wasn't the big end of town that was being targeted here. It almost seems as though the government has had to push the button in terms of panic mode and kind of walk this back a little bit to some degree, because now they've tried to sell it that it is only 11,000 people that it's going to impact. But is that the case?
Yeah, right. And this is, classic Labor behaviour, frankly. There's not a desire to grow the pie. There's just a desire to chop up the pie and redistribute it amongst their mates. And so I think that's what we're seeing here. And, that's not how we grow the economy. We grow the economy by releasing the handbrake on regulation, by actually saying we need to be sensible about what we're doing to the economy. I mean, this sort of, destruction of our fossil fuel industry and our gas industry and our, coal industry, frankly, is leading us down the path of no return. I mean, we were only talking the other night amongst a group of friends about the seriousness of the situation we find ourselves in, just by virtue of the fact that we really don't make anything in this country anymore, and we don't have the ability to refine fuel. It is a very worrying situation. And the answer to that is not attacking savings, not attacking the retirement plans of Australians, but it's actually being sensible and brave and disregarding things that Greta Thunberg has to say and start tackling Australian jobs and start bringing that money back in. I mean, at the very least, we should be talking about a nuclear industry. I've been saying that for years on end, as many others have been as well. We've got to start getting real. We are looking through very, very serious times down the tube, and it's not going to be fixed by windmills and solar panels, I can tell you.
Just one final point on superannuation. Again, the government's sell seems to be that it's super the intent. Let's get back to what the intent is, and that's to provide a dignified retirement. But then, is it a balancing act, and that you can have that dignified retirement when we know that the average male retires with a super balance of about 150, 160,000 and potentially less for women. So that dignified retirement, there's a lifetime of living to lead up to that retirement where there's significant hardships. So for the government to come out, and the very first thing they did on this move was to say, we are going to stop people from accessing their supers because what the Morrison government did was wrong.
Once again, it comes back to this fundamental misunderstanding that side of Parliament has about the money. The money is people's money. This is not, money to be used at the behest of Jim Chalmers or whoever. This is people's own money. So, I'm no economist, and I don't pretend to be, and I don't pretend to be, skilled in the art of understanding balance sheets and so on. But the reality here is that people are being told now what's going to happen to their money. This is nothing more than pinching from the, so-called robbing from the rich in order to give to in this case, the bucket of money which will be misused by the Labor government anyway. I mean, it just doesn't stack up. It's a broken promise, and people have a right to plan for their future, knowing how the rules are going to be set for time immemorial. So, look, I think this is a massive misstep, and it leaves me very concerned about what comes next.
Can I just ask, Senator Antic, that people see what they see on mainstream media with the work that you do, and you've mentioned there's a lot of work that yourself and your team go to undertake for Senate hearings. What support that people who subscribe to the work that you're doing, how can they assist you in doing this?
It's a good question. It's a really good question, actually, and it actually comes up a lot, because I think there are a lot of people out there that are frustrated by the state of affairs and are sensing something's not 100% right out there at the moment. You can almost, it feels, and I keep saying, it feels like in the last 5 years in particular, things have really taken a turn, and people are starting to say, this is not reflective of what I believe in. What can I do about it? And I say the same thing over and over again. The critical thing from where I sit is people getting involved in the political process. Now, you might say, what does that look like? Well, from where I sit, and of course I'm biased about this, but people that share our values, the party's values, I say the best thing you can do is sign up, and particularly for South Australians, get in touch with me. alex@believeinblue.com.au is my email address there. Let me know if you're interested, and get involved in the process of selecting people that will fight for our values. I think that's the missing piece at the moment. I think ultimately what we're seeing is the need for voices everywhere in Parliament, and it might be all sides of Parliament as well, but voices in there that people will stand against some of this stuff and stand for Australian national sovereignty, for freedom of choice, for freedom of speech, all the things that are, by the way, written into my party's constitution. There's no secret to that. But my view is, for the better part of the last probably 20 years, the left have been creeping while we've been sleeping. And the key to this, in my view, is putting some resolve back in parliaments all across the country. I probably would get an argument from people out of this, but I don't think this is work minor parties can do. I think this has got to be the domain of the parties of government, the party of government being, in my case, the Liberal Party, having the ability to push back on this stuff. And I think that's where we get our greatest bang for buck, by making sure that people who will stand for the values go to Parliament. And that's not a question of rolling people or, I always get accused, it's like, oh, that's branch stacking. It's not. It's simply being involved and having a say, so that you get a say at annual general meetings, you get a say at party pre-selections, and you get an opportunity to pick the candidate that best represents the party and its values. So by far, that is the best thing people can do. And if there are South Australians out there that feel strongly and want to join this, we've had some really good success later. We've got some really good new people coming into Parliament here in SA. I think we're ahead of the curve. But it only happens because people buy in, and it's as simple as that.
And as I mentioned at the start of this particular stream, here in Western Australia, we find ourselves with a very much a left view. Those outside South Australia, with the rise in what I would call online petitions, what impact outside the particular state, but on a federal issue that you've put forward?
Look, I think they are important. There's a whole range of issues on that. The first one is that ultimately they get presented, and it depends on what the petition is. But I heard one being presented by the Greens the other day, and they said, "Oh, this is a really big one. We had 15,000 signatures." Well, for the issues we're talking about, the petitions that I've run, that's a very small number, and I think it highlights once again that the quiet Australians are still the majority. That is the case. We just need to find voice. We need to find ways to get that voice across. One of them, as I said, is getting involved with the political process, but that doesn't mean we leave all the other stuff alone as well. There's still cause for respectful protests, lawful, respectful protests. There's still calls for writing to your MP. There's still causes for petitions. They're all part of the process. And people do get frustrated, I know that. But, for me, knowing there are people out there that, I can communicate with as well, and that share the values and share the views, and that are happy to put their name to it so that I can either present them to Parliament or present them to the Prime Minister, the Minister, whoever it might be, is still a really, really important part of the process. And I know there can be a bit of fatigue about all of that, but ultimately, this is to use an old expression from The Simpsons are some of one of the meats of the stew in this, I think I used in one of the episodes there, the meats of our cultural stew. It's still the same with politics. It's got to be a full court approach to it. And so look, they definitely do have value, and they definitely are listened to. Whether they're actioned upon, well, I say that becomes an issue of making sure we've got the right voices in Parliament, but they play their part.
And certainly, speaking of the right voices, I guess if only we could have an ability to have some type of scale of the likes of Senator Alex Antic and replicate that across many states in Australia, and we'd be in a much better position. A lot of people that would follow this platform pretty much living on every word that you're saying because of the character that you've shown, it's true representation.
Very nice of you to say that. I hope that I can offer some sort of voice to some of these issues that that need to be spoken about, and that's what I try to do. So it's nice to have that feedback. It's very, very kind.
Senator Antic, I observed the other day that there was yourself, Senator Matt Kavanagh, and I think Senator Ralph Babbitt. When we're talking about things that are hard conversations and are difficult and uncomfortable to talk about, but really when you think about it, should they be? That is the right to life. And we're talking about a 24-week-old baby. The pregnancy is aborted. Legislation provides in some states across Australia that can actually happen. That baby does not receive any medical care and essentially is left to die. You've introduced a motion to put in legislation to prevent this from happening, as I understand it.
Yeah, look, that's right. That's right. So just to go back a step, it depends on where you are in the country. The laws are all a little bit different, but they're all sort of gravitating towards the same awful end, which is similar to what we've got in South Australia now. 2 years ago, the Parliament here passed the Termination of Pregnancy Bill, which is basically a late-term abortion bill. Now, people are going to have a range of opinions on all of this, but what this bill actually does in South Australia now and other states is it allows pregnancies to be terminated right up to the day of birth. And that, to me, was an absolute appalling disgrace. And even though it wasn't in my Parliament, I took a pretty strong line on that and did what I could to try and raise awareness and let people know, because a lot of people just didn't believe it. They just could not believe that could be what was proposed.
You'd like to think on an issue like this, as you say, it is real. It's a difficult subject to talk about. Yeah. Mainstream media are not covering this. We will put the link in this package, and we'll steer that back to the online petition that you have.
Yeah, so people just don't accept that that's real. It's real, and there are things that have to be done in order to allow that process to take place. But it can happen, and it will happen, and it has happened in other states. one of the only useful things that came out of that exercise, in my view, was that in South Australia, it's now embedded into legislation that if one of those abortion procedures doesn't have its desired horrific effect, then the baby is born alive, that medical care is required to be given to the child, so that it, like any other person on the street. Now, people would say, of course, that's the way it is. Well, it's not the way it is in other states. States like Queensland and Victoria don't have those protections, and babies are born alive and left to die on the birthing table, or wherever it may be. We've heard instances of that, and in fact, George Christensen, MP from Queensland, in the last Parliament, introduced a bill to make that a requirement across the country, that babies that were born alive as a result of an abortion procedure would be given medical treatment. Now, that to me wouldn't seem like a very difficult or contentious thing. It strikes me as strange that we're even talking about it, but it's true. And that lapsed under the last Parliament. It didn't go anywhere. And so Matt Canavan, to his credit, another Queenslander from the National Party, has reintroduced that bill along with support from myself and from Ralph Babbitt from the United Australia Party, a very cross-party, bipartisan, tripartisan approach in the interests of doing the right thing morally. I mean, I think there'd be people out there listening to this right now that still couldn't believe that was the case, but rest assured it absolutely is. So we're hoping this bill will get introduced. It's going off to a committee hearing stage now, which will give people an opportunity to send in submissions, which they can do if they look for the bill. It's on the we still have a hearing, but if they Google Human Rights Born Alive Bill, and they will find it there. I've also got a petition on that one as well, and they can find it on my website, www.alexantic.com.au. And there's a take action section there, and you'll see that amongst other various campaigns we're running as well. So rest assured, this is important. I actually must admit, I don't off the top of my head know what the situation is in WA, but the point of this is, if it's bricked into federal legislation, then it doesn't matter what the states do. Babies are protected if they're born alive, and that's what we want to see. Been referred, but you can see it there. If you Google the bill, Human Rights Born Alive Bill, you'll certainly see the link to the committee come up on the Google page. And if you want to get a submission in, please do. They are important as well. So it doesn't matter what it looks like. It could be a paragraph or 2 paragraphs, but it would be good for the committee to hear the views of Australians who think that the fact that in certain states babies are born alive and simply left to die, that they think that's appalling. I think that would be really shocking. There's a lot got going on, but I just think, the sum of the parts, everyone's got their audience, and we have to try and talk real politics so that people get the message, because you're right, they're not getting it from Channel 10, they're not getting it from the local newspapers, so it's really, really important. So well done.
I guess a message, in general, if you could just say, with the current state of affairs with things across the nation, a message of hope, if you like.
Yeah, well, look, I think what I would say to people though is don't feel despondent. The views that we're talking about, I think, are quiet Australians' views. They're out there. You're basically in the majority. I think a lot of people don't want to talk about some of this stuff, and there'll be people who want to shy away from it because they have these views privately. But I can tell you that there are more that are with us than are against us. And they find each other. I'm sure we've all experienced that, where people will come up and say, I disagree with that and I agree with you and all that sort of stuff. I still think that's the majority, but we are up against a rising tide. I spoke about this in Parliament a couple of weeks back. What is basically a rising tide of new Marxism or communism, I think, which has taken the boardrooms and it's taken the schools and the universities. So my view is this is a very small voice that's being amplified. We've got to understand what we're dealing with. We've got to understand that, and in fact, Governor Ron DeSantis did some stuff on this today. He called out the ESG, environment, social and government targets in corporations as a way in which the left are using their inability to control parliaments, control politics, as a way of having influence. Well, once we start to understand why it is that every corporate is, chasing every woke issue, and why we're seeing it in schools, why we're seeing it in universities, we've got a way of dealing with it. The key thing is people staying strong on their views and making sure they understand that they're not alone, because I think there's a lot of hope out there, but unfortunately we've been caught napping by the real left in this country and across the world. So we've got a little way to come back, but we just need to keep getting people involved. And just by the way, last comment, it's not just about politics. It's not just about people getting involved in politics. It's also about making sure people have their say on school boards, on professional institutions like law societies and AMA and those sorts of things. Those voices are being drowned out at the moment. We've got to get people who share the values back into those institutions, and we'll go a long way to sort of correcting this. And I've still got a lot of hope. I think we're gonna win this one.
I guess on that note, a very, very busy man, and thank you very much, Senator Antic, for your time.
Brought to you by Freedom Media WA, where journalism should never be a government narrative. Like, share and subscribe to my channel to see real people telling real stories.
In the last few